Why does your daughter look exactly like me?
The question cracked through a silent, chandelier-lit gallery, and the single father standing across from Boston's most powerful CEO didn't even blink before he answered. What he said next would unravel a secret 7 years in the making. To understand how one calm sentence could shake an entire company to its foundation, we have to go back to the night everything began. Blake Harlan was 37 years old, and he believed one plain thing with his whole heart. If he worked hard enough and loved his little girl with everything he had, the two of them would be all right, even on the nights the world looked straight through him like he wasn't standing there at all. That belief was about to be tested in front of 300 people holding champagne glasses under the crystal chandeliers of the Museum of Fine Arts Boston at a youth art gallery opening sponsored by Hale Dynamics. A woman in a charcoal Armani suit stopped mid-sentence, stared at a 7-year-old girl in a hand-me-down navy dress, and asked in a voice that cracked right down the middle, "Why does your daughter look exactly like me?" The room went so quiet, you could hear the ice settling in someone's glass. Board members near the wine table turned. A photographer from a local business journal, there to shoot ribbon-cutting photos, quietly raised his camera instead. Blake Harlan didn't answer right away. He just tightened his grip, gentle but sure, on his daughter's small hand. His knuckles were scarred from 7 years of engine grease and cold mornings. His smile was warm, but it carried the weight of a history nobody in that room could see. "She doesn't just look like you," he said quietly. "She is your daughter." Before we get into how a broke single dad from a mechanic's garage ended up standing at the center of Boston's most powerful boardroom drama, we need to rewind. Because nothing about that night happened by accident, and nothing about Blake Harlan was ever quite what people assumed when they looked at his worn boots and his borrowed blazer. 6 hours earlier, Blake woke up at 4:45 in the morning in a one-bedroom apartment on Shawmut Avenue in Boston's South End. He had $47 to his name until Friday's paycheck. The porch swing outside, the one he'd fixed with his own 2 hands 2 summers back, creaked in the wind like it always did, a little off rhythm, like it was clearing its throat before speaking. He made oatmeal because eggs were 3 days from running out, and he drew a lopsided sun on a paper napkin for Lila's lunch, the same way he did every single school day. Just Lila, 7 years old, the whole world he had left. He drove his old Ford pickup down Starrow Drive with the windows cracked because the air conditioning had died back in June and there wasn't money to fix it yet. Not with the garage's slow season and the rent due on the 1st. Lila sang along to the radio, off-key and joyful, and Blake let himself smile, despite the tightness behind his ribs, a tightness that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with a secret he'd carried for 7 years. Because Blake Harlan wasn't just a mechanic raising a daughter alone. He was a man who had made a promise on the worst night of his life. A promise nobody in that gallery knew anything about. And somewhere in a downtown office on Boylston Street, there was a woman who had spent 7 years believing she'd lost something she would never get back. That woman was Valeria Kane, 34 years old, CEO of Hale Dynamics. A woman who commanded boardrooms with a single raised eyebrow. Tonight, her company was sponsoring a youth art showcase, a small gesture for good publicity her PR team had arranged. She hadn't planned on staying past the ribbon cutting. Then she saw the painting. It hung near the east wall, a child's careful brushstrokes rendering a small kitchen table, 2 chairs, a father and daughter sharing cereal under a crooked ceiling lamp. The placard read, "Love Makes Us Family," by Lila Harlan, age 7. Valeria stopped like she'd walked into glass. It wasn't the painting that stopped her heart, though. It was the silver bracelet on the small wrist of the girl standing beside it, a bracelet engraved with the letter V, dulled with age, exactly like the one she'd lost on a rainy night on Memorial Drive 7 years ago and never once stopped thinking about. "Mommy's eyes are like mine," Lila said suddenly. tilting her head at Valeria with the plain honesty only a 7-year-old can manage. Valeria's knees nearly gave out. Somewhere behind her, a board member whispered something to a colleague. A reporter stepped closer, sensing a story bigger than any ribbon cutting. Blake stood there in a blazer borrowed from his neighbor, 2 sizes too big through the shoulders, smelling faintly of engine oil no amount of cologne could fully hide. He hadn't come here for a scene. He'd come because his daughter had won first place, and he would have walked through fire in a stranger's jacket just to see her face when they called her name. He never expected to be standing across from the one woman who might finally learn the truth he'd protected for 7 long years. Before we get into the story any further, if you've ever watched a hard-working single father get overlooked by people who had no idea what he was really made of, stay with us, because this one is going to surprise you. So how did the daughter of one of Boston's most powerful CEOs end up being raised by a broke, single mechanic? And what really happened on Memorial Drive 7 years ago? That's exactly where we're headed next. To understand how a broke mechanic ended up raising the biological daughter of one of Boston's most powerful CEOs, you have to go back 8 years, to a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and heartbreak. Clara Harlan died on a Tuesday morning in early spring in a delivery room at Massachusetts General Hospital, from complications no one had predicted, and no one could stop in time. Their son didn't survive the night either. Blake was 29 years old, and in the space of 6 hours, he went from being a husband and a father-to-be to a man standing alone in a hospital hallway, holding a diaper bag he would never need. For the better part of a year, Blake didn't say much to anybody. He went to work at the garage on Harrison Avenue, came home to an apartment too quiet for one person, and every Sunday he bought a bundle of carnations from the flower stand near Boston Common. Never anything expensive, just enough to fill the chipped mason jar on his kitchen windowsill, the one Clara used to fill herself. Then came the rainy night on Memorial Drive. Blake was driving home from his second job, stocking shelves at an auto parts store until 11 most nights, when he saw a car pulled crooked onto the shoulder, hazards blinking weak through the downpour. He didn't think twice. He never did. He pulled over, popped his hood light, and found a young woman inside, soaked through, shaking, a newborn wrapped in a hospital blanket against her chest. She was 27 years old. Her name was Valeria Kane, though Blake wouldn't learn that for 7 more years. She wasn't just stranded, she was drowning in something bigger than a broken-down car. A family, a board of directors, an entire company built on an image that had no room in it for a scandal, a secret child, a mistake the shareholders could never know about. She'd been told in no uncertain terms that keeping the baby meant losing everything her father had built and everything she'd been promised to inherit. "I can't," she kept whispering, more to the baby than to Blake. "I can't. I can't." Blake didn't ask questions. He got her engine running, wrapped his own jacket around her shoulders, and said the only thing that felt true in that moment. "Whatever you decide tonight, kindness always finds its way back. I promise you that." He never expected her to place the baby in his arms and ask him, beg him, to get her somewhere safe and warm, while she pulled herself together enough to go back and face what was waiting for her. He never expected her to drive off into the rain, taillights disappearing down Memorial Drive, without ever coming back. Blake drove straight to Massachusetts General. That's where he met Grace Ramirez, 22 years old then, working nights as a nurse's aide, while she finished her engineering degree during the day. Grace watched Blake sit in that waiting room for 6 straight hours, refusing to leave until he knew the baby was safe. She watched him come back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for 2 weeks straight, sitting by a bassinet, talking softly to a baby who had no name yet on any form. "Some men run from that kind of responsibility," Grace told him once. Years later, when they'd both nearly forgotten she'd ever seen him that broken. "You ran toward it." "I never forgot that." No one ever came looking for the baby. Not really. Because 6 floors up, in a downtown office on Boylston Street, a man named Victor Lang, Valeria's most trusted advisor, the man her late father had personally chosen to protect the company, had quietly scrubbed every trace connecting Hale Dynamics or the Kane name to a maternity stay at all. There was never a specific placement record for him to hide because Valeria had left the clinic with the baby herself before his arrangements were ever finalized. What Victor erased was simpler and colder: any evidence she had given birth in the first place. When Blake brought an unidentified infant to Massachusetts General with no parent to name, the case moved through the state's ordinary child welfare process, a process invisible to a company that, on paper, had never had anything to do with a baby at all. Victor told Valeria something different. He told her the placement had gone through proper channels, that a vetted family had been found, that it was handled. When she asked to see proof months later, shaking, still raw from what she'd done, he produced a folder, a name changed, a city left deliberately vague. Just enough to quiet her grief without giving her anything real to follow. He warned her, gently but firmly, that pushing further risked unsealing records that could expose both of them to the very scandal he'd supposedly just contained. Valeria believed him. For 7 years, she believed him, because the alternative, unraveling the one comfort she'd been handed, felt like a risk she didn't think she had the right to take. Blake named the baby Lila, after his grandmother, and after 8 months of paperwork, home visits, and sleepless nights teaching himself everything there was to know about formula temperatures and 2 a.m. fevers, he adopted her, legally and completely, as his own. That was 7 years ago. Since then, Blake Harlan had learned to braid hair by watching the same 17-minute tutorial on repeat until his thick, calloused fingers finally got it right. He fixed the transmission on Miss Betty's ancient Buick 2 doors down for nothing but a plate of her banana bread. On Friday nights, the two of them sat on a couch with the stuffing coming out of one arm, watching the same 3 movies Lila had memorized word for word, and Blake never once let her see how tired he really was. He never told her the whole truth about the night she came into his life. Just enough, gently, in pieces, as she grew old enough to understand. Just enough for her to know she was wanted, deeply, completely, on purpose, even if the how of it was complicated. There were harder years mixed in, too, years nobody at that gallery would have guessed at. A stretch when Blake worked 2 jobs just to cover a hospital bill from Lila's tonsil surgery. A Christmas when the only gifts under the tree came from Miss Betty and the church food pantry 2 blocks over. And Blake told Lila it was because Santa liked to keep things simple that year, smiling the whole time so she'd never worry. He never once let his daughter see the numbers add up wrong on a night when they didn't. After the gallery reveal, Valeria didn't disappear back into her world the way everyone at Hale Dynamics expected her to. She showed up, unannounced, at Blake's garage on Harrison Avenue, dressed in a blazer that cost more than his monthly rent, standing awkwardly next to a rack of tires. At first, her disbelief came out sharp. "A mechanic like you? Raising her all this time?" she said, more stunned than cruel, though the words still landed hard. Blake didn't flinch. He just kept wiping his hands on a shop rag and said, 7 years of showing up says more than any title ever could. Something in Valeria's certainty cracked a little more every time she watched him with Lila. The patient way he crouched down to her eye level. The calm in his voice even when Lila threw a full 7-year-old tantrum in the cereal aisle. The way he never once made his daughter feel like a burden, even when his bank account said otherwise. At a PTA meeting the following week, Valeria watched his hand tremble slightly around a cheap paper coffee cup while another parent made a pointed comment about certain people volunteering for the fundraising committee, and watched him answer with nothing but a steady, polite smile that somehow said more than any argument could have. One evening, standing just outside the cracked screen door of the South End apartment, Valeria overheard him tucking Lila in. "Kindness always finds its way back, baby girl," Blake murmured. "Someday, you'll understand what I mean." Valeria's breath caught in her throat. She'd heard those exact words before. In the rain, on Memorial Drive, from a stranger she never got the name of, 7 years ago, on the worst night of her life. She just didn't understand yet how deep that connection really went. What Valeria doesn't know yet is standing right in front of her, and the truth is about to come out in front of everyone she answers to. Team Blake. He was right to stay silent all these years to protect Lila's world. Team Valeria. She deserved to know the truth about her own daughter, no matter the cost. Comment Blake or Valeria. Pick a side. The DNA results came back 11 days after the gallery reveal, from a small clinic just off Newberry Street. In a manila envelope Valeria's hands shook too hard to open on the first try. 99.98% probability of maternity. She read it twice, sitting in her parked car outside the clinic, before she let herself cry. Really cry. The kind of crying she hadn't allowed herself since she was 27 years old and soaking wet on the side of Memorial Drive. Rain tapped lightly against the windshield, an echo of that same storm 7 years back, and for a moment Valeria let herself sit inside the feeling instead of rushing past it the way she rushed past everything else in her life. Blake had waited outside the clinic with her that morning, standing a respectful distance away near the curb, Lila's small hand in his. He hadn't said a word when she came out with the envelope still sealed. He'd simply nodded once, like he already knew what it would say, and let her have the silence she needed. The news didn't stay quiet for long. Word moves fast in a company the size of Hale Dynamics. Faster still once a junior reporter caught wind of a mystery child connected to the CEO. Her lawyers pushed for a written statement instead. Something controlled, something they could edit twice before it ever reached a headline. Valeria overruled them. She'd spent 7 years letting other people manage the truth on her behalf. She wasn't about to let anyone do it again, least of all in a room where 2 reporters were already waiting for an answer. By the following Thursday, Valeria stood in front of her own board of directors, 12 people in tailored suits, plus those same 2 reporters who'd talked their way into the room, and confirmed, on the record, that Lila Harlan was her biological daughter. The room didn't gasp. Boardrooms rarely do. But Victor Lang, seated 3 chairs down, went very still. The kind of stillness that comes from a man calculating exactly how much trouble he's in. Valeria didn't wait for him to spin it. She placed a small recorder on the polished table, pressed play, and let the room hear Victor's own voice from 7 years earlier. A voicemail she'd only just recovered from an old backup server the week before. His voice was calm, clinical, chilling in its practicality. "We handle the paperwork quietly. We control the narrative. And in 6 months, nobody remembers there was ever a baby. Trust me. This is how we protect everything your father built." 12 pairs of eyes turned to Victor Lang. "I did what was necessary," Victor said, jaw tight, "to protect this company's stock price during an IPO quarter. I'd do it again." "You erased my daughter," Valeria said, and her voice, the same voice that had closed 9-figure deals without blinking, cracked wide open in front of everyone. "You told me she was placed with a good family. You told me it was handled. 7 years, Victor. 7 years. I thought I'd done the right thing." It was the first time in company history anyone had seen Valeria Kane lose her composure in a room full of people who reported to her. A junior board member would later admit, quietly, over drinks, that watching her hands shake around that recorder had unsettled him more than any earnings miss ever had. One of the reporters in the room, a woman who'd covered Hale Dynamics for nearly a decade, later wrote that she'd watched a dozen executives get caught in a dozen scandals over the years, but she'd never once seen a room go that still. Not from shock at the wrongdoing, but from something closer to second-hand grief. Watching a mother realize how much of her daughter's childhood she'd lost to a lie dressed up as protection. 2 days later, in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of the Boylston Street headquarters, Valeria tried the only thing she knew how to do when she felt out of control. She wrote a check. $15 million. Full custody transferred back to her. A trust fund for Lila that would set her up for 3 lifetimes. Blake sat across the table in his one good shirt, hands folded, listening to every number without a flicker of surprise on his face. "I'm not trying to buy her," Valeria said quickly, softer than her usual boardroom tone. I want to make this right. I want to give her everything I should have been able to give her from the start." Blake let the silence sit for a moment before he answered. "Money can't buy 7 years of showing up," he said. "It can't buy the 2 a.m. fevers, or learning to braid hair off a YouTube video, or sitting through every single school play because she looked for my face in the crowd every time. She knows one dad, Ms. Kane, and she loves him. That's not something a number changes." He slid the folder back across the table, untouched. Blake wasn't rejecting the money out of pride. He was protecting the one thing no lawyer or trust fund could replace. A 7-year-old's plain, unshaken belief that her father would always choose her over anything easier. Every fever he'd sat through alone, every night he'd gone without so she wouldn't have to, had built something in him that a number could only insult, never honor. Underneath his calm was a quiet fear that saying yes to any part of it might teach Lila, someday, that love could come with a price tag after all. "I'm not saying she doesn't need you in her life," he added, quieter now. "I think she does. But it starts with showing up, same as it did for me, not with a check." The room went silent in a different way this time. Not shocked, exactly, but rearranged. 2 board members exchanged a look. A junior assistant taking notes in the corner would later tell 3 separate co-workers that she'd never seen anyone turn down 8 figures without so much as blinking. Within 48 hours, word of the rejected offer leaked. Not through Blake, who never said a word to anyone outside that room, but through an assistant who couldn't keep the story to herself. Hale Dynamics stock dipped nearly 6% in a single afternoon on nothing but rumor and speculation about their CEO's judgment, her personal life spilling messily into public view for the first time in her career. Valeria sat alone in her office that evening, the city lights of Boston blinking on outside her window. And for the first time and longer than she could remember, she didn't know what to do next. She had built her entire identity on being the person in the room who always had the answer. And here was a man with grease under his fingernails and $47 to his name who had just handed her the most important lesson of her adult life, free of charge, and asked for nothing in return. She thought about the trust fund papers still sitting untouched in her desk drawer, about the way Blake's calm voice hadn't wavered once, even with $15 million on the table and half her board watching to see if he'd crack. Men had negotiated with her for far less and folded within minutes. Blake hadn't negotiated at all. He'd simply told the truth and let it stand. That's when Victor Lang made his second mistake. He showed up at her office uninvited, insisting the story could still be managed. A carefully worded statement, an agreement for Blake to sign, a generous settlement to make the whole thing disappear quietly before the quarterly earnings call. He was still talking in terms of narrative control, still treating a little girl's entire existence like a line item on a spreadsheet. Valeria was the one who cut him off this time. "Get out of my office, Victor." It was Grace Ramirez, now a systems engineer at Hale Dynamics, though Valeria had no idea until that very moment that she'd once been a young nurse's aide who'd watched Blake sit vigil over a nameless baby 7 years earlier, who stepped forward from the doorway with a folder of her own. I worked under Victor's division for 2 years before I transferred, Grace said carefully. I kept records. Things that didn't sit right with me at the time. I think you're going to want to see these before he leaves this building. Valeria looked between the two of them, the man who'd spent 7 years burying a truth, and the woman who'd spent 7 years quietly holding on to proof of it, and understood, all at once, just how many people had been carrying pieces of this story in silence, waiting for someone brave enough to finally put them together. Victor left the building that afternoon, still employed, still smiling for the security cameras on his way out, still certain he could talk his way through whatever came next. On her outside counsel's advice, Valeria spent the days that followed building a case solid enough to survive a courtroom challenge rather than acting on instinct alone. A deliberate, careful delay that gave Victor just enough room to set something far more dangerous into motion before anyone came for him. Just when it seemed like the worst had already happened, Hale Dynamics was about to face a crisis far bigger than one family's secret, and it would take the last person anyone expected to help save it. 12 days after the boardroom offer that shook Hale Dynamics to its foundation, an even bigger crisis hit, one that had nothing to do with Blake or Lila at all, and everything to do with the company Valeria had spent her whole career building. At a public demonstration near Boston Harbor, in front of investors, journalists, and 36 live-stream cameras, Hale Dynamics' new self-driving prototype lost braking function for 17 full seconds on a closed test track. 17 seconds doesn't sound like much until you're watching a 2-ton vehicle roll toward a barrier with nothing stopping it, and the test engineer inside white-knuckling a wheel that wouldn't respond. No one was seriously hurt, but the footage was everywhere within the hour, replayed on every business channel, clipped into 1,000 social media posts, the test engineer's white-knuckled hands on the wheel becoming the image of the week, whether Hale Dynamics wanted it to be or not. By the time markets closed the next day, Hale Dynamics stock had fallen 18%. Analysts on financial news channels used words like catastrophic and unrecoverable. Behind closed doors, HR had already drafted a memo warning that layoffs, more than 500 positions, were now on the table if investor confidence didn't stabilize within the month. Grace Ramirez sat at her desk that night, long after everyone else had gone home, running diagnostic after diagnostic, refusing to believe 17 years of engineering excellence had simply failed on its own. She was a single mother of 2. If this went the way the rumors said it would, her job was one of the 500 at risk, and she knew at least a dozen other names on that list personally. People with mortgages, people with kids in daycare, people who couldn't just absorb a layoff the way executives could. She found it just after midnight, a small, deliberately buried override in the braking algorithm, installed months earlier through an access credential that traced back, carefully, quietly, to Victor Lang's old engineering clearance, a broad, cross-division override he'd held for over a decade as the one person Valeria's father had ever trusted with access to everything, and that no one had thought to revoke. Not a random bug, not bad luck. Grace kept digging past midnight, and what she found wasn't a distraction tactic at all. It was a paper trail of shell accounts, quietly built over the past year, positioned to profit the moment the stock cratered on cue. The guardianship scandal hadn't caused any of it. It had simply forced Victor's hand, pushing him to trigger a plan he'd built for himself long before Blake Harlan ever walked into that gallery. Sooner and messier than he'd intended, before anyone got close enough to notice the accounts underneath it. While the company scrambled behind closed doors, Blake Harlan did something nobody at Hale Dynamics expected. He opened up his own garage on Harrison Avenue for the weekend and called it Community Repair Day. Free brake inspections, free oil changes, free diagnostics for anyone in the neighborhood who needed it. No appointment necessary. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was just what Blake did on slow weekends anyway. Except this time, word spread, and half the block showed up. Grace showed up too, off the record, still shaken from what she'd found the night before. She sat on an overturned bucket near Blake's workbench, and instead of talking about circuit boards or corporate liability, Blake just asked her how she was holding up. Really holding up. Not as an engineer. As a person about to maybe lose the thing that put food on her table. "I keep thinking about my kids," Grace admitted, voice tight. "If this company goes under—" "It's not going under," Blake said simply, wiping his hands on a rag. "Not if the truth gets out before the fear does. People forgive mistakes. They don't forgive cover-ups. There's a difference, and it matters which one this turns out to be." Something about the calm, steady way he said it, no lecture, no false comfort, just plain truth, helped Grace breathe again. She stayed at the garage another hour, watching Blake work a stubborn brake line with a teenager from down the block leaning over his shoulder, asking questions Blake answered patiently, one at a time, like the boy's curiosity mattered as much as the job itself. By morning, she'd built the full case. Timestamps, access logs, the override code itself, all of it pointing straight back to Victor. Valeria watched almost all of it unfold from her office, through the lobby security feed Blake didn't know was catching more than deliveries and foot traffic. Blake crouched under an old Honda Civic explaining torque specs to a teenager from the neighborhood. Blake handing Grace a cup of coffee and just listening. Blake refusing, twice, when a grateful customer tried to pay him more than the job was worth. It was watching those quiet, unremarkable moments, nobody performing for a camera, nobody trying to look good, that made Valeria finally go digging through 7-year-old records she'd avoided for 7 years on purpose. She found the roadside assistance log first. A single line entry from a private towing company contracted through her father's old insurance policy, dated the exact night on Memorial Drive. Assist rendered. Passenger vehicle, non-injury. Good Samaritan on scene, declined compensation. No name recorded. Just a service code and a timestamp that matched, minute for minute, the worst night of her life. Her hands went cold reading it. She'd spent 7 years picturing a stranger's face in the rain and never once thought to look for a paper trail. It had been sitting there the whole time. 3 clicks deep in an old claims database nobody had bothered to close out. For 7 years, Valeria had avoided looking back at that night, because looking back meant admitting how much of her daughter's life she'd handed over to a stranger's mercy. Finding Blake's name buried in that old database wasn't just a shocking coincidence. It was proof that the one decision she trusted least, made in the worst moment of her life, had turned out to be the only one that mattered. Underneath the disbelief was something harder to admit. The man she'd once dismissed as beneath her had quietly been the steadiest, most trustworthy person in the entire story. Then she found something that broke her open completely. A file from 4 years earlier, not routed through the company at all, she realized, but through Victor's own private legal contact, showing that he'd quietly traced the old hospital records to a Blake Harlan of South End, Boston, and offered him a substantial settlement in exchange for his silence and a signed non-disclosure agreement, all without another soul at Hale Dynamics ever knowing the search had happened. Blake had turned it down. Not with a lawyer, not with a counteroffer. Just a short, handwritten note the legal team had scanned into the file before closing it out. "I'm not raising my daughter to think love comes with a price tag attached. Please don't contact me again." He'd known, for at least 4 years, that someone from Hale Dynamics might come asking questions. He protected Lila from the mess of it anyway, quietly, without ever telling anyone, without ever asking for anything in return. Valeria read the note 3 times, tracing the handwriting with one finger, imagining Blake sitting at that same kitchen table on Shawmut Avenue writing it, probably late at night, after Lila had gone to sleep, probably with grease still under his nails from a full day at the garage, choosing every word carefully, because he knew exactly what was at stake and refusing to let money touch it anyway. Valeria sat alone at her desk, with both files open in front of her, and for the second time in a month, the woman who ran boardrooms without blinking put her head down and wept. The man everyone at that gallery had quietly dismissed, the mechanic in the borrowed blazer, the single dad with $47 to his name, was the same man who had held her daughter's hand through a storm on Memorial Drive. The same man who was, at that very moment, working to save the jobs of 500 employees at the company that had once tried to erase him from the story entirely. By Sunday afternoon, Grace's evidence had made its way to the board's audit committee, and word began spreading through the building that the braking failure hadn't been an engineering flaw at all. Employees who'd spent the week bracing for layoff notices instead found themselves talking, quietly and with something like disbelief, about a mechanic from South End who'd spent his own Saturday fixing their neighbors' cars for free, while their own company was busy trying to survive a scandal he hadn't caused. Grace found Valeria in the parking garage that evening, keys in hand, looking like she hadn't slept in 2 days. "He doesn't know I gave you all this," Grace said quietly, gesturing to the folder Valeria still held. "He wouldn't want credit for any of it. That's just who he is." Valeria nodded slowly, looking down at the two files, one filled with betrayal, the other with quiet, unclaimed kindness, and understood that the truth she'd spent 7 years running from had been standing right in front of her the whole time, waiting patiently for her to notice. Valeria finally had every piece of the truth in front of her, but the hardest part wasn't uncovering it. It was figuring out what she owed the man who never once asked for anything in return. Victor Lang was arrested on a Tuesday morning, escorted out of the Hale Dynamics lobby in handcuffs while stunned employees watched from the mezzanine level. The same lobby where his security badge had opened doors for over a decade. The evidence Grace had compiled was more than enough. The sabotage code, the buried adoption records, financial transfers that didn't add up under closer scrutiny. But it was what Victor said in his formal statement to investigators, almost as an afterthought, that hit Valeria hardest of all. He hadn't just manipulated one crisis 7 years ago. He'd been quietly steering decisions in Valeria's family for nearly 15 years, advising her father to freeze her out of major decisions for her own good, encouraging distance between her and the people who might have complicated the tidy story he was building around the company's image. Valeria sat through that part of the deposition transcript twice before she could fully absorb it. The loneliness she'd carried most of her adult life hadn't just happened. Some of it had been engineered. It should have broken her completely. Instead, for the first time in longer than she could remember, it made something in her go quiet and clear. 15 years of decisions she'd assumed were her own, the distance from old friends, the closed-door approach to her father's estate, even the quiet pressure that had once made keeping her daughter feel impossible, had been nudged along by a man paid to protect an image instead of a person. She wasn't angry anymore, not really. She was just done letting anyone else decide what her life was supposed to look like. She started showing up at the South End apartment on Wednesdays, then Wednesdays and Fridays, then most days that didn't involve a board meeting she couldn't reschedule. She brought takeout instead of catering. She sat cross-legged on the floor of Lila's room, with a tutorial video paused on her phone, attempting to braid her daughter's hair for the first time in her life. Failing badly. Laughing at herself in a way none of her employees would have recognized. "You're pulling too tight," Lila informed her, patient as any 7-year-old critic. "Daddy watches the video 17 times before he gets it right, too." 17, Valeria repeated, glancing at Blake across the small kitchen. And something passed between them that wasn't quite a smile, but was close to one. She cut her work hours nearly in half, a decision the board grumbled about privately, and the market, oddly, rewarded, once the sabotage story broke and public sympathy shifted hard in her favor. She quietly arranged, through a community development fund with no name attached to Hale Dynamics, an investment to help Blake expand the garage on Harrison Avenue. A second bay, updated equipment, room to hire 2 more mechanics from the neighborhood. She made sure it came through as a community grant, not a handout, because she'd learned, watching him for weeks now, exactly what it would do to his pride if it looked like charity. Blake found out anyway. He always did. He didn't turn it down. He just showed up at her office one evening, tired from a long day, and said, "You didn't have to hide it." "I wanted you to say yes," Valeria admitted, "not out of guilt. I was afraid if you knew it was me, you'd say no on principle." "Maybe," Blake said, honest as always. "But I'm learning something too. Letting people help isn't the same as needing to be rescued." It wasn't all healing and quiet dinners, though. The personal lawsuit came fast. Shareholders furious about the stock collapse, demanding accountability somewhere beyond Victor alone. Valeria's own lawyers advised her that settling quickly, using a significant portion of her personal assets rather than the company's already strained reserves, was the only way to protect 500 jobs and stop the bleeding before it spread further. She agreed without much hesitation. It meant giving up the kind of financial security she'd never had to think twice about before, a price she paid without complaint, because for the first time, protecting people mattered more to her than protecting her image. Blake didn't say much through any of it. He didn't need to. He showed up anyway, sitting in the hallway outside her lawyer's office with a thermos of coffee he'd made at home because he knew hers would be terrible. Driving her home once when she was too exhausted to trust herself behind the wheel. Never once asking what any of it meant for the two of them. One night, after the papers were signed and the worst of the settlement was behind her, Valeria drove out to her father's old house in Beacon Hill, empty since his passing, still full of boxes she'd never had the heart to sort through. She sat on the floor of his study, surrounded by old photographs and ledgers, the smell of dust and cedar thick in the quiet, and let herself think, really think, about 15 years of careful, quiet manipulation dressed up as protection. She thought about a rainy night on Memorial Drive and a stranger's voice telling her kindness always finds its way back. She put her head down against a stack of her father's old files and cried. Not the sharp, shocked tears from the gallery, and not the guilty tears from the DNA results. This was something else. Something closer to relief. Like a woman finally setting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying her entire adult life. For the first time since she was 27 years old, standing soaked and shaking beside a broken-down car, Valeria Kane let herself feel something she hadn't dared feel in 7 long years. Hope that maybe she hadn't lost everything that night after all. There was still one Sunday dinner that stuck with her more than any boardroom victory. Blake had made spaghetti, nothing fancy, and Lila had insisted Valeria sit in the good chair at the little kitchen table, the one with the wobble Blake always meant to fix and never quite got around to. Miss Betty stopped by with banana bread, took one look at the three of them and said, without a hint of surprise in her voice, "Well, don't you all look like you belong together?" Nobody corrected her. Everything Valeria had spent 7 years running from was finally behind her. But one truth was still waiting to surface, one that would change how she saw Blake Harlan completely. The last piece of truth came from something so small Valeria almost missed it. Going through more of her father's boxes in the Beacon Hill study to close out his estate paperwork, she found a dusty security disc from the private clinic where Lila was born. Footage never meant to be reviewed, just a routine exterior camera covering the clinic's parking lot and the stretch of road out front from that stormy night 7 years ago. She watched herself on the grainy black and white feed, sobbing behind the wheel of her car as she pulled out of the lot too fast, headlights swerving dangerously close to a guardrail on the wet road. Moments before, another vehicle flashed its lights and eased in front of her, slowing the whole lane down, giving her just enough room to steady the wheel and pull over safely. The plate number was grainy, but the make of the truck was unmistakable. An old Ford pickup, the same one still parked most mornings outside Blake's apartment on Shawmut Avenue. He hadn't just handed the baby to safety. He'd followed her car for 3 blocks that night, worried she wasn't in any state to be driving, and made sure she got off that road alive before he ever turned toward the hospital. When she asked him about it, quietly, sitting across from him at his kitchen table on a Sunday evening, Blake didn't deny it. "I checked on you," he admitted. "Not often. Not in a way that crossed any lines, just enough, over the years, through public records here and there, to know you were okay. I figured if Lila ever needed her mother, really needed her, I wanted to know where to find you." 7 years, Valeria whispered. "You watched from a distance for 7 years, and you never once tried to profit from it. Never once tried to use it." "It was never about that," Blake said simply. "It was about her. It was always just about her." Valeria didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, without any of the practiced composure that had carried her through a decade of boardrooms, she came around the small kitchen table, knelt down in front of his chair, and took both of his rough, calloused hands in hers. For a woman who had spent her whole career mistaking control for safety, kneeling in front of Blake wasn't surrender. It was the first fully honest thing she'd done in 7 years. Her deepest fear had never really been about the company or the money. It was the quieter, older fear that she wasn't capable of being loved without her title attached to it. Letting go of every advantage she still held was the only way she knew to prove, to herself as much as to him, that she wanted the family itself, not an outcome she could still manage from a distance. "I'm sorry," she said, voice breaking completely. "For every assumption I made about you that first night. For the check I tried to write like it could fix 7 years. I don't want the company or the money or any of it if it means losing what you and Lila have built. I'll walk away from all of it if that's what it takes." Blake shook his head, gentle but sure. "I'm not asking you to walk away from anything. I'm asking you to keep showing up. That's it. That's all it ever takes. Real love grows through kindness every single day, not through grand gestures. Just showing up, again and again, until it becomes home." Outside, the rain that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke loose over the south end, drumming soft against the windows. Valeria laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, through the tears still on her face, and when Blake reached up to brush one away, she leaned into him instead, and their first kiss happened right there in his small kitchen, with the porch swing creaking outside in the wind like it was clearing its throat in approval. Lila found them like that a minute later, and instead of being confused, she just grinned like she'd known all along, running straight into both of them at once, small arms barely reaching around them both. "Told you," she said proudly, as if she'd been waiting 7 years for the 2 grown-ups in her life to finally catch up. Weeks later, on a clear evening at Boston Harbor, the 3 of them walked along the waterfront as the sun went down gold and pink over the water. Lila skipping ahead to collect smooth stones along the walkway, Blake's hand finding Valeria's without either of them making it a big moment. "You saved me long before I knew it," Valeria told him quietly, watching Lila crouch down near the water. "On that road. And every day since, without even trying to." Blake just shrugged, the way he always did when someone tried to hand him credit he didn't think he needed. "I just did what anybody should do," he said. "Stop when someone needs help. Show up the next day. And the day after that." "Not everybody does that," Valeria said. "Not even close." Not long after, the Museum of Fine Arts Boston hosted a small showcase for the youth art program's returning artists. Lila's new painting hung near the same east wall as before. 3 figures this time, standing together at a harbor, hand in hand, titled "Family Built by Love and Second Chances." Valeria stood beside Blake at the opening, no board members whispering behind her back this time, and told a small group of reporters, plainly and without a hint of performance, that the most important lesson of her life had come from a mechanic who never once asked her for anything, and a little girl who taught her that family isn't something you're born into or buy your way toward, it's something you build, one ordinary day at a time. This story reminds us that the love people remember longest rarely comes wrapped in grand speeches. It looks like oatmeal made at 4:45 in the morning, a napkin sun drawn in ballpoint pen, a porch swing fixed twice because it mattered enough to fix right the second time. If there's a Blake in your family, a son, a grandson, a nephew raising kids alone, don't wait for a big occasion to say so. This Thursday, call him and name one specific thing you've noticed. The way he never misses a school pickup, the patience in his voice at 8 o'clock at night. Then pull your own mother's recipe box down off the shelf and bring something warm to his door on Sunday. Not because he needs rescuing, because showing up in small, ordinary ways is the only kind of love that ever really lasts. Every line in these emotional stories comes from real human insight and lived experience. AI was used only to enhance clarity and pacing, allowing deep lessons about kindness, systemic bias, and personal strength to resonate with a global audience.